So good evening. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Dr. Cyril Shah. I'm a pediatrician and a primary care physician here at UCLA and a founding member of the Immigrant Youth Task Force here at UCLA. I'm also the chair of our Immigrant Health Committee for our Southern California chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. We're thrilled to welcome you to our first Immigrant Youth Speaker Series event this evening. This one entitled Family Separation, a multidisciplinary discussion of the consequences of and alternatives to the detention of immigrant children. This is an overview of the timing for today, so we'll do a brief introduction and then we'll begin with our speakers, and we're really going to try to focus as much time on their content and then on having a rich discussion with all of you after they're done presenting their presentations. And then we'll have a period for refreshments and networking following the event. Our students and faculty are currently passing out pencils and note cards. They should be doing that shortly. I think they're still at the back. They will give you the opportunity to write down your questions, and then after the individual speakers and then before the panel, we'll be collecting the note cards to allow for questions from the audience. You'll also have time to speak with our presenters after the event and to network with the other attendees after the close. There'll be light refreshments outside in the lobby. Some of you may have seen them on your way in. And we invite you all to enjoy those with us and to continue the conversation after we end, which will be shortly before 6 o'clock. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, namely the UCLA Pritzker Center for Strengthening Children and Families. The UCLA Immigrant Youth Task Force was founded in 2019 through a seed grant from the UCLA Pritzker Center for Strengthening Children and Families, which is a new UCLA campus-wide initiative focused on the needs of children and youth who are disconnected from traditional pathways to success, particularly foster youth. The seed grant to support this event was made possible by the Pritzker Family Foundation. The task force represents one of 5 initiatives and projects across the UCLA campus and throughout LA County to benefit children and families. The Pritzker Center works in partnership with schools, nonprofits, community organizations, and governmental agencies to support advocacy, policy, and research for vulnerable youth. Their work involves close collaboration with the LA County Department of Child and Family Services, which forms the foundation of our child welfare system and serves as a crucial source of support for many of the children and families that we'll be discussing tonight. The objectives of the task force are to unite experts at UCLA from diverse fields, including law, medicine, psychology, public health, Chicano studies, social welfare, sociology, and education, among others, to create a comprehensive database of scholarship, research, and outreach at UCLA on issues of relevance to immigrant youth, to partner with community organizations serving immigrant youth and families, and to educate, engage, and empower students and trainees as future community leaders and advocates. The speakers do not have any financial relationships to disclose, and any political opinions expressed in this talk are those of the speakers and do not represent those of UCLA. The UCLA Immigrant Youth Task Force is nonpartisan and seeks to support evidence-based best practices and policies that support the well-being of all children. So our partners, our formal partnerships are with the Office of Immigrant Affairs through the Los Angeles County, as well as with the American Academy of Pediatrics, so the Southern California chapter. And then we have many, many allies, which you'll see coming up on the screen. These are organizations that share our general ethos and principles, and with whom we'll be working in the coming year to develop more formal relationships and potentially partnerships and projects. So our projects currently are focused in 3 main areas. First, we host local and national experts to discuss hot topics related to immigrant youth. Tonight marks our first Immigrant Youth Speaker Series. We'll be featuring UCLA faculty from many unique divisions on campus through additional events in fall of 2019 and in early 2020. Please make sure you sign in and join our mailing list before you leave tonight so you can receive information about our next speaker event. Our second main objective involves the creation of a comprehensive campus database of scholarship, research and outreach at UCLA on issues of relevance to immigrant youth, and we're working to compile an expansive list of faculty throughout various departments and divisions at UCLA, and this will be available on our website. We hope this will further promote interdisciplinary collaborations on campus, as well as help community organizations identify experts and potential partners here at UCLA. Finally, we also work to sponsor graduate and undergraduate students to participate in research and advocacy projects for immigrant youth in partnership with community and governmental organizations with mentorship from UCLA faculty. Oops, sorry. Pictured here are our first two fellows. Natalia Garcia Peñalosa, who's a medical student at the UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine, and then Abu Ibrahim Bianjoro, who's a first-year MPH student at the Public Health School. We'll be accepting applications for our fall fellowship in the coming months and encourage students of all disciplines to take a look at the application and to consider applying. So we're going to be talking today about the issue of family separation. For those of us from the medical field, I think this has been a very heart-wrenching topic, just in terms of how we think about the long-lasting impact of trauma. And when we think about efforts to try to address this issue on a systematic level, it brings up a lot of questions for us about law, public health, and the intersection of medicine with those disciplines. Our conversations today are going to be focusing on that intersection there and seeing where we as a group can bring together our relevant expertise and experiences to help advocate for policies and programs that better support the health of immigrant youth, both locally in our country as well as nationally, or in our county as well as nationally. I'm going to spend the rest of the time introducing our speakers because I think they are really going to do a great job introducing the issue and talking about the areas that are the most relevant, I think, for this discussion and setting the stage for priority areas that I think we as a group from all of our different backgrounds can contribute. Before I begin, I just wanted to ask, quickly taking a poll of who's here, how many of you are undergraduates here at UCLA? Okay. How many of you are from the law school? From the medical school? From the public health school? Sociology? Psychology? Great. And any other discipline that I may have missed? And where are you guys from? Social work? Social work as well? Okay. Wonderful. Anyone else? Okay, I think that's really helpful for us to understand why this is such a rich forum for this discussion. All right, so our first speaker is UCLA Law alumnus Stephen Schaefer. He works at Esperanza Immigrant Rights Project, where he serves as the supervising attorney for the legal orientation program for custodians of unaccompanied minors. Stephen received his BA in sociology and ethnicity, race, and migration from Yale University, and his master's in sociology from Princeton University. He then received his JD from UCLA School of Law. Prior to joining Esperanza, Stephen worked representing immigrant survivors of crimes, as well as abused, abandoned, and neglected immigrant children. Stephen continues to use his background as a sociologist to shed light on critical issues for immigrants in removal proceedings, including access to counsel in immigration court and family detention. Tonight, he will provide important context about the events that led up to the policy of family separation last spring and the controversy surrounding the laws that dictate how children are treated throughout the immigration proceedings.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I always say that to the kids. I do a lot of presentation with kids. In the morning, I say, good evening. And I wait for them to see if they're actually paying attention. So I'm going to get the clicker set up, and then we'll start. Oh, excuse me, guys. I'm just going to cancel out of this. I'm sorry, everyone. Okay. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm so happy to see all of you here. My name is Ethan Schaefer. I am an attorney at the Rights Project. I supervise the released youth that's coming to our community. I'm also a research affiliate with the UCLA School of Law. My background in sociology, I do research on advocacy counsel, family detention, and defenses. Oh, sorry. Thank you. And I just want to thank the UCLA Immigrant Youth Speaker Series for having me. This is a great opportunity, and I'm glad to see so many different kinds of people. I thought it was going to be at the law school initially, and it was just going to be a bunch of lawyers or law students, and I think this is going to be a better crowd, so I appreciate you all being here. So I'd like to tell you what to expect. We'll be here about 30 minutes, my presentation. I'm going to lay the foundation for what we're going to be talking about, the legal foundation. So the Flores Settlement Agreement dictates a lot of what's going on right now. It kind of structures the controversies, the conversations that we're going to have. So I'm going to give you the history of the Flores Agreement, which talks about how we take care of our kids in detention. The next thing I'm going to talk about is I'm going to give everybody a kind of a primer on the system of detaining immigrant children and families, so that when we talk about these issues that are going to be coming forward, you know where these kids have been. Part of the issue is that we hear about kids in immigration detention. We don't know what kinds of kids we're talking about, where they've come through, where they come from. So I'm going to give you that opportunity to learn this, and I think it will help when you think about trauma, the pathways these kids have gone through. And then I'm going to end with challenges to the Flores Settlement Agreement, and there are many, and they're in the news. So, but before we start on the presentation itself, I want to do some definitional issues. Okay, so there are two kinds of immigrant kids. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of immigrant kids, but for the purpose of the talk, there are accompanied minors and unaccompanied minors. The accompanied minors are the ones that came with their parents, and they're processed through the immigration system with a parent or legal guardian. Then there are unaccompanied minors, and those are the ones that either arrived without their parents or legal guardian or were separated from them. So they may have been accompanied when they came to the border, but once they're separated, they're designated as an unaccompanied minor, and there's a separate system for those kids. We're going to talk a lot about government custody and what that means, but there's different kinds of government custody. So there's being with Customs and Border Patrol, maybe being in an ICE family detention facility, maybe we're talking about being in a shelter for unaccompanied refugee kids. It's very different. So when you think about government custody, you're going to want to specify in your mind what kind of government custody. And finally, this is a really important point. I am only focusing on separation of families at the border. Okay, families are separated all the time in the United States. ICE may take a parent, ICE may come take a loved one from the family. That's a family separation that's happening. There's discussion of disallowing mixed legal status families from receiving certain kinds of housing, government housing. That will separate families. For the purposes of this talk, I'm really talking about family separation at the border. You guys ready? Good. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start with the punchline. I want you to know what we're talking about. We're going to talk about the history, but I really want you to know from the very beginning about the Flores Settlement Agreement. Okay? The agreement is from 1997. It's been more than 20 years, and it requires the government to treat immigrant children with care. It's a very basic agreement. They need to be in safe, clean, and licensed facilities, and they need to be released as soon as possible because that's in their best interest. I told you about the difference between unaccompanied and accompanied minors. This agreement applies to all kids, those with families and those that are not here with their family. Okay? It really defines how we, as a country, are going to treat the most vulnerable kids here. They come here seeking refuge and seeking asylum. Okay. So why is the Flores settlement in the news? And if you're reading the news, you probably will have heard it. If not, bear with me. It's important because there's been a lot of scrutiny recently about how kids are being treated or mistreated in government custody. Okay? 6 confirmed children who have died in the custody of the government. We just found out today that there was another minor that had been killed, that had passed away in September of last year. This part is important for our discussion now because it sets the limits on how long kids can be in government custody. So if you want to keep families together but detain them for months and months and months, the Flores Agreement is going to put a stop to it. So the government, the Trump administration, talks a lot about the Flores Agreement. And one thing that it does is that, you remember the family separation issue that came up last year? It blamed the Flores Agreement. It blamed the agreement that was there to protect kids. So let's look at Chuck Grassley has to say. I want to stop the separation of families at the border by repealing the Flores Agreement, which he says requires separation of families. Okay, Trump, just this year, wrote in a letter to Congress that one of the most pressing legal challenges to protect kids from abuse, the Flores Agreement, because it prevents families from being held together through removal. Oh. Now, is Flores to blame? Is it really a binary choice? No, of course not. It's a decision of whether or not you want to detain families, okay? Is long-term detention of families the answer? You know it's not, and for a lot of reasons, many of which Katie will talk about. But detention isn't the answer for kids or for families. So when you hear this kind of binary choice, Flores is to blame for keeping families separated, it's not true. It's only true if you think that families and kids need to be detained together for long term. Do you guys know what the Flores Settlement Agreement is? Kind of like the basics, right? It's how we take care of kids when we detain immigrant kids. I want to talk about the history of Flores Agreement. Because one thing that happens is we have Donald Trump here on April 5th. The Flores decision is a disaster. I have to tell you, Judge Flores, whoever you may be, a lot of you are laughing. That's good. That means you maybe have an idea of what's going on. The Flores settlement is not named after a judge. I can't tell if he's just trying to own the libs, make us mad, or if he really doesn't know. But by the time you leave, you will know Jenny Lisette Flores. Okay. To understand the 1997 agreement, we need to go back to the 80s. Now, many of you weren't born. I was still relatively young at the time. But ICE didn't exist. ICE did not exist. At the time, the immigration system was run under the Immigration and Naturalization Service. They were in charge of both detaining immigrant kids and prosecuting them. Detain and deport, detain and deport. So the same organization that's meant to protect these kids is also one that's going to prosecute them. It's a huge conflict of interest. And you can imagine that they didn't do a very good job with it. This is how they treated many children in their care. Handcuffed and strip searched. Some minors body cavity searched. It is what it says. They did this to 16, 15, 13, 14-year-olds. They gave them few opportunities for recreation, no education, and they had to share bathrooms and living and sleeping arrangement with randos, with random people. Okay? Adults of both sexes that they didn't know. Oftentimes there was kind of like informal, older women would take care of the younger girls just to protect them. So, the Flores settlement actually comes out of our backyard. Behavioral Systems Southwest at the time was running detention facilities in California, including a repurposed 1950s-style Americana motel in Hollywood. We're just going to put some barbed wire on there, cover over the pool, and detain kids and adults. Now, when I was researching this, I was surprised to learn that this was in Hollywood, right off of Sunset Boulevard onto Longpre near the In-N-Out. Now, I went to school at UCLA, the law school, 3 years. Guess what street I lived on for those 3 years? The Longpre. Yeah, I lived on the same street across the other side, 101. But this is right in the middle of families. Okay, it had almost been shut down because of the prostitution and drug use at the hotel. Okay. So, the LA Times did an interesting story on it where they talked to the neighbors. And one of the neighbors said that these kids, they look like they're prisoners in a prisoner of war camp. One poor woman, speaking in Spanish, so stressed because she said, I see my people behind those bars. This is the context in which Jenny Lisette Flores was being detained. She's a 15-year-old Salvadoran girl who was housed in another one of these BSS facilities in Pasadena. Okay? She was strip searched. She was sleeping with adults of both sexes in rooms, right? Nobody that she knew. She had come here to be with her mom. ICE, at the time allegedly, which seems about right, they changed their policy. They said, well, we're not going to release you to maybe your aunt, who's a citizen. You can live with your aunt. No, we're not going to let you do that. We want your mom to come here. We know your mom's undocumented. So, bring her here so we can interrogate her and deport her. So Jenny is languishing in this space because her mother doesn't want to come to be removed from the country. Something had to be done. So, we have, in 1985, class action litigation. 12 years later, we have a stipulated agreement. Now, I'm not going to go through this entire history, okay, because it's a long history. It went to the district courts, up to the Supreme Court, back down. At the very end of the day, INS didn't want to litigate it. They didn't want to have discovery. They didn't want to have to go through the rigmarole. So they came together, said, okay, let's just settle this. Okay, so the Flores Agreement. Who is it named after? Okay. Judge Flores? No. Jenny Lisette Flores. The agreement set a nationwide policy. It's a framework for all minors. Okay? It says that if they're going to be in government custody, they need to be placed in a non-secure facility licensed to care for minors. Now, I put asterisk on non-secure. It depends on the level and the need of the minor. If the minor's going through some serious psychiatric issues, then they might need to be in a secure facility. That means it's locked. Non-secure is unlocked. They can leave if they need. It means they need to be held in the least restrictive setting appropriate to their needs, and they need to be released without unnecessary delay. The agreement says kids should not be detained. If they're going to be detained, it should be as short as possible, and they need to be returned to family as quickly as possible. Now, when the government signed this, they said, okay, give us 45 days. We're going to write official regulations. We don't need to deal with this agreement. We'll create a law. It never happened. What happened? 20 years. Okay? So what I'm going to do now is talk about the changes to the law. Okay, we know what the Florida Settlement Agreement is. We know the framework that it lays down. Things have changed in the past 20 years to provide a bit of structure around the settlement agreement. So I want you to know what's happened. Okay, we had INS in 2002. After 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security was created. It created the Customs and Border Patrol, Immigration Customs Enforcement, and Citizenship and Immigration Services. The CBP works on the border, generally. ICE works internally, and CIS is the organization that deals with visas and applications for relief. One thing that this Homeland Security Act did was it took the care and custody of minors away from DHS, from INS, and it gave it to the Department of Health and Human Services. Okay? And underneath the Department of Health and Human Services, we have the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Now, this is the organization that's in charge of taking care of unaccompanied minors. Okay? If we're talking about accompanied minors, we're talking more around this with their family with ICE. The TVPRA was passed in 2008. That actually kind of took some of the language from Flores, codified it. It also clarified that ORR is going to be in charge of the detaining and caring for minors. So ORR is a pretty important organization for our discussion. So let's talk about the current system. Unaccompanied minors. They're under 18 and they don't come with their parents. Asterisk, right? They may have come with their parents and been separated. But if they're not with their parents, they are going to be in CBP control for less than 72 hours. And then they need to be transferred to ORR custody. Okay? There's a whole shelter system built up we'll talk about. And the goal is to get them released to the communities. There are some special rules for Mexico and Canada. They can actually be deported right back to their home countries immediately. And there are currently more than 14,000 kids in ORR custody. Imagine that, 14,000. And there are plans to move 225,000 more kids over the next 5 years. Okay, this is the ORR shelter system. Kids come, they're in CBP custody, and they're supposed to be transferred to these different shelters. For example, this is the Casa Padre shelter in Brownsville, Texas. Now, I worked at Walmart for 2 years in high school. So this is a Walmart. They converted a Walmart to house kids. Okay. And then they're supposed to be released to our communities. Over half the kids are released to just 5 states. California is number 1 at the moment. In 2016, we hit a high of 7,400 minors. And in 2019, we're going to reach those levels. So what happens to accompanied minors? And this is where the family component comes in. Okay. Unaccompanied minors go through the ORR system. They may or may not be released to the communities. Accompanied minors, those are the ones that are coming with their parents. This is the idea of family detention and family separation. When they come with their parents, sometimes they're immediately released to communities. They're detained by CBP, but they're not placed in any kind of ICE detention facility. Other times, they're placed in this family residential program that's run by ICE. Okay? Now, this is an important point. When kids are detained with families, Flores still applies. They need to be released with all due haste. What that's been interpreted to mean at this point is 20 days if there's an influx or an emergency. So kids are going to be placed in a facility with their parents, but they need to get out of there because it's not in their best interest to be detained. Now, I did some research with my colleagues at UCLA about family detention. There were at one time 5 separate family residential facilities. At the moment, there are only 3 open, holding up to 2,000 families. Now, in 2016, we hit a high of more than 3,500 parents and kids in detention. But something has happened. As of a couple days ago, ICE has decided that they're going to just throw families out of these detention facilities, which may be in the minors' best interest, we don't know, so that they can detain more people. Their capacity, active capacity, is 34,000 people detained. Today, it's at 52,000. So, family detention is still an important issue to talk about. At the moment, it's not as salient because families are being released. Okay. So, let's talk about what's at stake with the Flores settlement. Judge Flores, whoever you may be, is it a disaster? No, it's important. Okay. What's at stake? The family detention facilities haven't been adequately taking care of kids. Some of those that are no longer active were shut down because they failed to provide adequate facilities. Children in CBP and the Office of Refugee Resettlement Custody have been subjected to egregious mistreatment, including forced medication. Now, sometimes I think these issues should be named. Okay, so we have a young 19-month-old toddler who passed away weeks after being released from the family detention facility. We have Jacqueline Jael Makin, 7 years old, died of sepsis days after she was detained with her father last year. Felipe Gomez Alonso, 8 years old, passed away of the flu, complicated by sepsis on Christmas Eve last year, after 6 days in CBP custody. 72 hours is the law. Juan de Leon Gutierrez, 16 years old, died last month in that Walmart. He didn't die there, but he was housed in that one Walmart ORR facility. Last week, an unidentified 2-year-old boy died after he and his mother were detained by the Customs and Border Protection. And just recently, Carlos Gregorio Hernandez Vasquez passed away on Monday after being detained by CBP for 6 days. Again, it's more than the 72 hours that are allotted. We just found out today that another minor passed away in 2018 in September. And we're just finding out now. Okay? So to call it government noncompliance, I think, is a euphemism when you're talking about the death of children. But it's important that the government be held to account. And how does that happen? Litigation. Organization and litigation. And litigation under force is one of the main avenues to make sure that kids are being protected. So I want you to introduce you to Judge Dolly G. She's an important actor, important player. She's a double Bruin. Red meat out there for you guys. She went to UCLA undergrad, and she got her JD at UCLA as well. She was nominated to the federal district courts in 2009 by Obama. She was appointed in 2010 as the first Chinese American woman. And in 2015, she was assigned to the Flores case. Okay. She's been at the forefront of enforcing the requirement that the government treat children in their detention with care. Okay. So, some of the things that she's reinforced. There cannot be a no-release policy for minors with a parent. You can't keep a parent and a child together and just not release the minor. The minor is protected under the Flores Agreement. Okay? It applies to all minors. If they're accompanied, they need to be released as expeditiously as possible, 20 days. Okay? She's held that the Border Patrol conditions are not in compliance, and she actually appointed a special monitor to be able to go to these facilities to make sure the government's keeping its end of the bargain. Flores is being challenged. It seems like every day. Okay? So we have the zero tolerance policy we talked about when they were separating families and kids, blaming the Flores settlement for a purposeful decision to charge adults with illegal entry and separating from the kids. In June 28, the Department of Justice tried to amend Flores, saying, people are not going to show up to court. So we need to detain kids longer, and we need to exempt ICE from the requirement that these facilities be licensed for kids? No. It's a cynical attempt, she said, to bypass the judiciary, right? They've had 20 years to come up with the law, and they haven't done it. Okay. So, September, they proposed some rule changes. And these things will generally take effect. They open it up for comments. Comments are closed. Fortunately, it's on hold. But we feel like we're kind of held hostage. Fortunately, Judge G has said, as soon as it comes out, they're going to let us know before they make it final. And if it does, then we can put it on hold and assess whether or not it actually complies with Flores. Okay. And just this month, Lindsey Graham wants to get rid of the 20-day rule so we can keep kids detained with their parents for longer. Now, I hope you remember when you leave today who Jenny Lisette Flores is. And I think that hopefully we can all agree that detention is not the answer. It's not the answer for kids. It's not the answer for families. And I thank you so much for listening. I hope we have a useful and productive conversation at the end.
Thank you, Stephen. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Katie McLaughlin. She's a distinguished guest lecturer from the Harvard University Department of Psychology. Dr. McLaughlin is a clinical psychologist with interests in how environmental experience influences brain and behavioral development in children and adolescents. She has a joint PhD in clinical psychology and chronic disease epidemiology from Yale University. Her research examines how adverse environmental experiences shape emotional, cognitive, and neurobiological development throughout childhood and adolescence. Specifically, her work seeks to understand how experiences of stress, trauma, and social disadvantage in childhood alter developmental processes in ways that increase risk for psychopathology.
I think I'll do it without you. Yeah. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to engage with you about this important topic. I wanted to start by saying that I'm sure everybody in this audience has strong feelings and opinions about the policies that we're here to discuss today. I want to make it clear that while I also have strong opinions about these policies, that I am not a policy expert. That's not what I'm here to talk with you about today. Instead, what I'd like to do is share with you what we know about how experiences of adversity in childhood, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that, influence children's development, and the role that caregivers play as an important sort of buffer against some of the negative long-term consequences that can occur in kids who have experienced adversity. And in this way, I hope that the science of adversity, the sort of emerging science on this issue, can lead to meaningful discussions about how to address this issue from both a practice and a policy perspective. So I first want to talk sort of briefly about the scope of this problem, and I think Stephen has really set the issue up quite well. So what you see on the slide are the number of people who are apprehended at our southwestern border each month. Since 2017, that's been about 32,000 people each month attempting to enter the country. What I'd like to highlight is that this is not a new phenomenon, no matter what our politics might suggest. And in fact, the rate of apprehensions at the border has been pretty consistent for the past decade and was even higher during the Bush administration. So who are these people? What you see here is information about who's been apprehended at the border in the past few months. In recent months, for reasons people don't really understand, there's been a surge in apprehensions at the border, more than 76,000 people in February alone. This was a decades-long high. And it's a sign that these sort of harsh policies, increased prosecutions, and issues around asylum and harsh detention are not reversing these trends or really serving as a deterrent as they are intended. But what I really want to highlight about this is that the majority of these people are families traveling with children, and there's also a considerable number of unaccompanied minors, which Stephen was speaking about. And so why have these harsh policies not served as a deterrent? So this is not my expertise, and although I can only speculate about what drives any individual family to make the decision to sort of take the risk of trying to enter our country, it's clear that many of these families are fleeing extreme violence and poverty that has become endemic in many parts of Central America. So what you see on this figure is the average homicide rate in a variety of cities around the world. So the average is right here, 6.2. Here's Los Angeles. And as you go up, you can see a dramatic increase in the proportion of homicides per 100,000 people. And while in the US, we certainly have some cities like New Orleans and St. Louis who fall into sort of this more violent category, all of the circles that you see here in red are cities in Central and South America, right? So there's this sort of concentration of extreme violence that's happening in the places where these people are fleeing. And so what we know is that when they're arriving at our border, the kids who are being apprehended are coming from contexts in which they have already experienced an enormous amount of adversity and exposure to violence. Much of this violence is directed at women and children. This is sort of an opinion piece that was written recently in the New York Times about violence directed at women in these contexts. And so these kids are arriving at our border, sort of fleeing extreme forms of adversity. And then this is the situation they arrive in. So this is obviously a photograph that is familiar to most people that really sparked media attention to this issue. And this is an image of a detention facility where children are currently being housed. So this is sort of the big picture context of thinking about adversity that I wanted to start with. But what I'm here to talk with you today about are what the consequences of these kinds of experiences of adversity are for children's development. So how do experiences of violence and chronic poverty that these children have faced before they arrive at the U.S., and I'll get to what some of the likely implications of the separation itself are towards the end of the talk, but how does this context of adversity in which these kids have developed, how is it likely to impact their development? So I first want to start by just providing a brief definition of what I mean by adversity. So when I talk about adversity, I'm referring to a wide range of experiences or stressors that happen during childhood. We're typically talking about things that are stressors that are either quite severe or chronic, like exposure to violence or neglect. And they're experiences that are going to require adaptation by an average child. And that really represent a deviation from the expectable environment. And so when I say expectable environment, what I mean is that sort of as we're developing, our brain is sort of expecting a range of experiences from our environments, which range from sensory inputs like getting light into our eyes so we can learn how to see, and having a sensitive and responsive caregiver who responds to our needs. And so what we're talking about here are experiences that really represent a very significant deviation from that expectable environment in which our brain is expecting to develop in. These experiences often involve things like threat, so being exposed to violence, deprivation, so having an absence of some kind of expected input, like the presence of a caregiver, or loss, significant loss, which this child separations could be considered. So zooming back out from this particular issue, I want to talk with you a little bit about what we know about exposure to adversity among kids right here in the United States, where much of this research has been conducted. And so I want to start by making the point that adversity is actually remarkably common. So what you see in this slide is data from a nationally representative sample of about 10,000 children in the United States, simply showing the prevalence of exposure to different kinds of adversity, ranging from things like parental loss, parental separation, indicators of parental maladjustment, exposure to domestic violence, or serious indicators of maltreatment like abuse and neglect, and exposure to chronic poverty. And you can see that these sort of individual experiences vary, but on the whole, more than half of all kids in this country have experienced at least one of these events by the time they reach adulthood. So adversity exposure, even right here in the US, is quite common. And we know, unfortunately, that these experiences tend to cluster. So kids who are exposed to one of these kinds of adversities tend to experience many others, which is the situation that likely characterizes many of these kids who are being apprehended at the border. So the way to read this figure is simply to look at the particular type of adversity, and what you see here is the mean number of other adversities that a kid experienced if they experience any one. So if you look at parental loss or parental separation here in the US, on average, those kids have experienced 4 additional adversities. Okay, so for the rest of the time, what I'm going to talk to you about are the consequences of these kinds of experiences for children's development, and I'm going to touch on 4 areas. I'm going to talk briefly about the links between early adversity exposure and mental health. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the changes that happen to brain development and behavioral development that we think might explain the strong link between adversity and mental health. I'm going to talk a bit about the link between these early experiences and your risk for developing chronic diseases and even early mortality in adulthood, and the role that accelerations in biological aging after exposure to adversity might play in explaining some of those relationships. Okay, so let me talk first about mental health. So that high prevalence of adversity is concerning for a variety of reasons, one of which is because these experiences are very powerfully related to mental health. So when I say mental health, I'm talking about things like depression, anxiety, ADHD, substance use problems. And what you see in this slide is the relationship between exposure to adversity in that nationally representative sample that I told you about earlier, and the likelihood that a kid developed a mental disorder like anxiety, depression, ADHD by the time they reached adulthood. And what you see is this really strong sort of dose-response relationship where as exposure to adversity goes up, your risk for developing a mental health problem by the time you reach adulthood also goes up fairly dramatically, with kids at the highest levels of exposure being more than 5 times as likely to develop some form of mental health problem by the time they reach adulthood. So just to put that in context, that's a 500% increase in the risk. And we know that the kinds of mental health problems that emerge following adversity also tend to be more severe. So in this slide, what you're seeing is the relationship, again, in that nationally representative sample between exposure to adversity and among kids who developed a mental health problem, how severe that problem was in terms of the amount of functional impairment it created in their lives, how it got in the way of their ability to do things in their relationships. And again, you see this sort of graded relationship that becomes very steep at the high end, with kids at the highest levels of exposure being almost 6 times as likely to develop a mental disorder that we would classify as severe or very severe. And I'm not going to belabor this point. I'm just going to show you 2 examples. This is from another study. But I could put basically every type of mental health problem that we know about on this slide, and the picture would look the same. Okay, depression, anxiety, substance use problems, suicide. There's a graded and stark relationship between adversity and many, many kinds of mental health problems. So this is kind of a transdiagnostic phenomenon. It's not specific to any one kind of mental health problem. And the last point I'd like to make about this really powerful relationship between adversity and mental health is actually that exposure to adversity explains a very meaningful proportion of mental illness in the population. And so what you're seeing on this slide is something called a population attributable risk proportion. That's just a big mouthful of a word that means what proportion of a disease in the population is explained by a particular exposure. And so to put these numbers in context, the proportion of cardiovascular disease in the United States that's explained by cigarette smoking is about 20%. And so what you're seeing on this slide are the proportion of all mental illness that begins in these 4 phases of the life course that's explained by exposure to those adversities I showed you on the slide about 10 back. And these numbers are really striking. What you see is that about 50%, almost 50% of all mental disorders that begin in children in this country are explained by exposure to adversity. About 1/3 of all mental disorders that begin during adolescence. But strikingly, even in adulthood, we find that about 1 in 4 mental disorders that starts in adults in this country is attributable or explained by exposure to adversity in childhood. Okay. So what explains these powerful relationships? Why is exposure to adversity in childhood such a potent predictor of psychopathology? And what are some of the mechanisms that explain this association? Now, I could give, a whole separate talk for an hour about these mechanisms. I'm just going to touch on a few really salient ones that seem to play a role across lots of different types of adversity. So in particular, when we're talking about our ways in which sort of different types of exposures, experiences of adversity might alter the way that children's brains are developing and alter their behavioral development in ways that predispose them to developing these mental health problems. Okay, so kind of the take home I'd like you to take from this sort of section of the talk is just sort of think for a minute about what your brain should be doing if you're growing up in a dangerous environment, right? What your brain is trying to do is make predictions about what to expect next and behave in ways that are sort of consistent with your goals. And at the most fundamental level, survival is our most important goal, right? So if you're growing up in a dangerous environment, what happens is that your brain sort of shifts the way that it's processing information in a way that helps you to rapidly identify threats in the environment, right? And this is an adaptive response. This is exactly what you'd like your brain to be doing if you're in a dangerous environment. But unfortunately, these sort of shifts in how the brain is processing information can also have long-term consequences for your mental health. So I'm going to talk very briefly about how exposure to trauma, growing up in a dangerous environment, can impact systems in the brain that help us to learn about threats, predict when they're going to happen, and help us mobilize behavioral responses when there is a threat in the environment. These kinds of processes involve a number of brain areas and circuits, but primarily regions like the amygdala and hippocampus, which are two that I'm going to talk about today, as well as regions in the prefrontal cortex. Okay. So Eamon McCrory over in the UK was actually one of the first people to demonstrate that kids who are growing up in environments characterized by danger, who've been exposed to trauma, have higher reactivity in this region of the brain called the amygdala, which you see right here, to cues that signify the presence of a threat, like this angry face. So when you see an angry face, it's a pretty good sign that something dangerous could happen, right, when someone's angry. And what he showed is that when kids were looking at faces like this, relative to faces that were neutral or exhibiting other expressions, you saw higher activity in this region of the brain that helps us to kind of identify salient cues in the environment, things that we should be paying attention to, and helps us to mobilize behavioral responses to them. So again, because survival is kind of our most fundamental goal, the amygdala responds quite strongly to cues that are threatening, and because we often need to mobilize a behavioral response to those kinds of cues. So this pattern kind of suggests that when you're growing up in a dangerous environment, your brain becomes kind of hyper-attuned to signals that there could be a threat around, probably to help you mobilize a behavioral response to stay safe. Now, this finding has proved remarkably durable. This was kind of a small initial study. In my lab, we've replicated this effect among kids who were growing up in environments characterized by trauma within the family. And in that experiment, we were showing kids sort of negative images that might have looked something like this and neutral images. And what we found is sort of substantially elevated responses in the amygdala among kids who had experienced trauma to these negative cues relative to neutral cues. This has been replicated right here at UCLA by a researcher named Nim Tottenham, who'd studied kids growing up in deprived institutional settings early in life, so kids who are separated from their caregivers. Again, you see the same pattern of sort of elevated response in the amygdala to cues that could be potentially threatening. And this has also been confirmed recently in meta-analyses, which is just a term that's used to describe kind of putting all the different studies together and looking at their pooled effects. So across lots of different kinds of adversity, we see that this region of the brain that helps us to sort of identify threats, learn about them, mobilize behavioral responses to them seems to be sort of hyperactive in kids who have grown up in dangerous environments. I sort of just want to make the point that it's not all about the amygdala. The amygdala is part of a broad network of regions in the brain that helps us to identify sort of salient cues in the environment. And we see this pattern in other regions of this sort of salience network, including the anterior insula right here. This is, again, from that original study from Eamon's lab, where you see the more violence a kid experienced, the more the insula, this region in the salience network, is responding to threat cues. And we've replicated that effect in my lab as well. Okay, so what do these patterns of brain activity mean? Okay, I want to give you just a few examples of the kinds of behaviors that we think sort of correspond to these changes in the brain. So the sort of heightened sensitivity to threat that we see in the brain sort of parallels lots of work that we've known about in psychology for decades about how kids who've experienced trauma or violence sort of process social information. So I'm going to give you a few examples. So we know for example, that if you show kids, if you give them a task where you kind of have this face that looks a little blurred out, and you slowly show them sort of more and more of that face until you can see over at this side, this guy kind of looks angry, right? And you ask them to tell you, when can you identify the emotion in that face? What you see is that kids who've been growing up in adverse contexts, especially kids exposed to violence, can identify anger in that face with less perceptual information than kids who have never experienced violence. Again, suggesting this kind of behavioral sensitivity to threat that corresponds with these brain patterns. And we see these in a lot of other kinds of behavioral tasks. We see that in something called hostile attribution biases, where, for example, if kids are in ambiguous situations, so let's say you're playing at recess and some kids are playing kickball next to you and you get hit in the back of the head with a kickball. How do you interpret that situation? If you're a kid who's been exposed to violence, you're much more likely to say somebody's trying to hurt me than if you're a kid who has never experienced violence, who might say it was probably an accident. And we also see these sort of biases in how attention is captured by cues in the environment. So I want you guys to keep your eyes on the screen, and you're going to see two faces and then a sort of dot appear behind one of the faces. It's going to be quick. So you see there's an angry face and a neutral face. What we see is that when you sort of present kids with those two cues, kids who have been exposed to adversity, their attention is sort of captured by that threatening face. And we know that because they're much faster to respond to that cue when it appears behind the angry face than when it appears behind the neutral face. So these are just some behavioral examples of how these shifts in how the brain is processing threat-related information sort of shift the way that these kids are processing information about social relationships. So why should we care about this? Why does this matter? We know that these patterns of brain and behavioral development are strong predictors of mental health problems. So sort of coming back to this issue we started with, that these kids are at very elevated risk for psychopathology. This is just one study. I could have put dozens on the screen to show you, but it's a simple example showing that all of these red bars here are responses in this region of the brain that we were talking about, the amygdala, to different kinds of threatening sort of cues. And the blue bars are people without anxiety. And so sort of the take home is just that this response in the brain, this hypersensitivity to threat, seems to predispose these kids down the road to developing mental health problems like anxiety. I could have shown you the same thing for PTSD, for depression, across a wide range of mental health problems. These shifts in the brain that might be keeping these kids safe in a dangerous environment are having long-term consequences for their mental health. Same pattern in the insula, the other brain area that I talked to you about. Okay. So shifting gears to sort of one other aspect of brain development that we know is sort of strongly impacted by early adversity. I want to talk a little bit about a different area of the brain called the hippocampus. How many people know what the hippocampus is? Just want to test it. Okay, everybody knows what the hippocampus is. Great. So the hippocampus is involved in learning and memory, but it's also sort of a central node in the HPA axis, which is one of our body's central stress response systems, right? It actually sits sort of at the top of that system. When cortisol is released into the bloodstream from your adrenal glands, it travels back up to your brain, and it binds to receptors in the hippocampus that help to turn off the stress response once it's been activated. And we know actually from lots of work in animal models that this is a region of the brain that's highly sensitive to stress hormones like cortisol and glucocorticoids. And that chronic exposure to those stress hormones can lead to damage in this area of the brain. And it can actually lead to shrinkage in the size of the hippocampus. And so we've seen this in a lot of sort of animal models, but recently people have also examined how exposure to adversity, especially trauma in childhood, impacts the human development of the hippocampus. And I'm just going to show you a couple of quick findings. This is some data from my lab. But basically this work that we see in animal models where chronic exposure to stress leads to shrinkage in this area of the brain, we also see in human children. So in kids who've been exposed to violence, what you see in this figure here is that there's a substantial reduction in the volume of the hippocampus. This region of the brain gets smaller, likely because it's highly sensitive and potentially can be damaged by the effects of high levels of stress hormones. This is a separate study from Jamie Hansen's lab showing that it's not just kids exposed to trauma, but actually lots of different kinds of adversity. In the same way as lots of different kinds of adversity can impact the hippocampus, lots of kinds of early adversity can also impact the volume of the hippocampus, leading to reductions in volume. Okay, so why might we care about that? So the hippocampus, again, is this brain region that's really strongly involved in learning and memory. And so what we think is that changes in this area of the brain could lead to some of the sort of problems that we see in kids who've experienced adversity in academic settings, where we know they consistently sort of perform more poorly than their peers in school. And we actually see that the sort of reductions in the volume of the hippocampus seem to have implications for your memory, right? So this is a study that we did in my lab where we showed kids things in the scanner while we scanned them that looked like this, and we asked them to try to remember the pairings between faces and objects. This is a task that requires you to kind of bring your hippocampus online. And what we saw is that the kids who had been exposed to trauma had significantly less sort of activation in this region. They're sort of using this region of the brain less. Which is problematic because we know that the more you're sort of recruiting this region, the better your memory is later for those pictures and faces that were paired together. And in fact, we see that these changes in how the hippocampus is functioning are associated with differences in their sort of memory for these pictures that they were trying to remember. So changes in this area of the brain can lead to sort of lots of downstream consequences for these kids' learning and memory and their performance in school most likely. And finally, we also care about changes in this area of the brain because it's highly involved in many forms of mental health problems. What I'm showing you here is a meta-analysis, which again is just combining the results of lots of different studies looking at reductions in hippocampal volume and major depression. I could have shown you the same slide for PTSD and other kinds of mental health problems, but what this is showing you is that across lots of studies, people who have reductions in hippocampal volume seem to be at increased risk for developing major depression. So these changes in the brain that happen in response to adversity are sort of explaining or playing a role in the elevations in mental health problems that we see in these kids. Okay, so let me move on to sort of one additional topic before I talk a little bit about the role of caregivers. So I'm a clinical psychologist. Most of what we focus on in my lab are these sort of mental health consequences of adversity. But in the past couple of decades, there's been increasing attention to the effect that these early experiences can have on physical health in the long term when you reach adulthood, right? That these early experiences can shape risk for all kinds of chronic diseases that are experienced in adulthood. And what I'm going to do is just show you a couple slides. I could have put a number of different disease outcomes on the slide. I just picked a few. This is data from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which was done at Kaiser Permanente, and really was the first study to draw attention to this issue. But the same kind of association that I showed you for mental health, where higher exposure to adversity increases your risk for mental health problems, also seems to be true for many of the leading causes of death in this country, where you see this sort of magnified risk for having a stroke, for having heart disease, for cancer, for diabetes. And in fact, this slide simply shows as your adversity exposure goes up, your risk of developing a wide range of the number of different health problems that you have seems to increase. And again, we see this sort of dose-response relationship. The more adversity, the worse your physical health later in life. And strikingly, these are findings that just came out a couple years ago from Edith Chen and Greg Miller at Northwestern. And what they showed, and this is in a large longitudinal study of older adults in this country that have been followed for many years, and what they were interested in is whether exposure to trauma in childhood would lead to differences in early mortality. And the take home is what you see is that the steeper this curve is, the sort of higher the mortality rate among that group. And what you can see is that kids who are exposed to early trauma as adults later in life have a higher rate of early mortality compared to kids who have never experienced trauma. So the effects of these early experiences, not just on your mental health, but on your physical health, last and persist throughout the life course. I want to sort of end this section of the talk by talking about a potential mechanism that people have become quite interested in recent years that might explain these effects. And basically the take home from this is that it seems like exposure to early adversity, especially trauma, might actually accelerate the pace at which you're aging and might contribute to this sort of risk for chronic diseases and early mortality later. So I'm going to show you a little bit of data about different aspects of sort of accelerated biological aging that have been observed among kids exposed to adversity. So a really simple one, and this is a very widely replicated effect, is that kids who've been exposed to early adversity get to puberty faster. Right, so this is showing you data from a large nationally representative sample of girls. Here you see exposure to trauma, and what I'm showing you on the y-axis is age of menarche. So when did these girls sort of reach puberty? And you can see that that age gets younger as they were exposed to more trauma. This is a study we did in my lab, sort of replicating that effect, showing that as your exposure to trauma goes up, how far along you are in puberty relative to your age also goes up, suggesting that these kids are developing more quickly. But perhaps more strikingly, we and others have also shown that your exposure to, as your exposure to adversity goes up, it doesn't just mean you're getting to puberty faster, it actually accelerates aging in your body at a cellular level. People have shown this with measures called telomeres, which are sort of little caps that sit on the end of your DNA strands and are sort of markers of cellular aging. In this study, we were using a metric of what people call epigenetic aging, which is looking at DNA methylation patterns across the genome that are highly correlated with age, and showing that essentially your aging at a cellular level becomes accelerated. You start to age faster if you've experienced early adversity. And recently, my lab has conducted a meta-analysis on this topic. There are almost 60,000 participants in this meta-analysis. And what you can see basically is across all of these various studies of kids exposed to trauma, we see an acceleration in how fast kids are getting to puberty. So they're aging faster. And when we look at measures of cellular aging, we see the same effect. So the body is actually speeding up the aging process following exposure to adversity early in life. And we know that this faster development has implications for both your physical and mental health, right? For obvious reasons. So these markers of cellular aging have been linked to early onset of cardiovascular disease, to cancer, and even mortality. But the pubertal development findings that I showed you, there's a long sort of tradition of showing that especially girls who get to puberty earlier than their peers are at elevated risk for a whole host of mental health problems like depression and anxiety and substance use. So this acceleration in the aging process following adversity may be a central mechanism that explains these high rates of physical and mental health problems in kids who've experienced adversity. Okay, so I just gave you a lot of depressing news, but I sort of want to give you a small piece of good news that is not relevant for the kids who are currently being separated from their parents at the border. And the good news, and I'm just going to show you a few slides and I'm going to stop talking, is that caregivers provide an enormous source of protection against all of the negative consequences I just described to you. What do I mean by that? So in general, there's the phenomenon that people call caregiver buffering of adversity effects. And the logic is quite simple, that if you're a kid who's been exposed to adversity, and you don't have a supportive caregiving relationship, right? If we sort of zoom back out and think about what adversity is, lots of the kids who are experiencing these kinds of events like being abused don't have a supportive caregiver, right? So if you're experiencing trauma, you don't have a supportive caregiving relationship, you're going to see an increase in adverse consequences of all of the kinds that I just described to you. But what we see very consistently across lots of different outcomes is that kids who do have a supportive caregiver in their life are buffered or protected against developing many of these long-term negative consequences. So caregivers really provide this enormous source of protection against the negative long-term consequences of early adversity. I'm going to show you just a few examples of that before I wrap up. So when we think about mental health, I could have put dozens of different images up here. This is a study of kids who are actually homeless in the United States, exposed to high levels of adversity. And what you see is that as their exposure to adversity goes up, their risk for mental health problems also goes up. But that risk is buffered or is smaller in the kids who have strong parental support relative to kids who have less supportive caregiving relationships. So caregivers are buffering some of these negative consequences. This might be surprising, but this is actually work done right here at UCLA by Nim Tottenham and Dylan G. Those patterns of amygdala reactivity that I showed you, changes in the brain that happen as a function of adversity, are also buffered by the presence of caregivers. So in this study, what they did was show kids in the scanner pictures of their mom and pictures of a stranger. And you see in young kids, this effect, these error bars are big, but there's a statistical difference here between how reactive your amygdala is when it's your mother versus a stranger if you're a child. So there's caregiver buffering even of these sort of biological consequences of adversity. We'll skip that in the sake of time. And even the changes in hippocampal volume that I talked to you about. This is work from Joan Luby, who looked at caregiving very early in life and how it impacted the development of the hippocampus, the brain region we talked about second. And basically, the way to interpret this graph is that higher values here mean higher levels of maternal support. And what you see is that early in life, kids who have stronger maternal support have increased volume of the hippocampus with age. So caregivers also seem to play a buffering role even in this region of the brain. And finally, this is academic performance. These are kids who are growing up homeless. And what you see is that as these kids get exposed to more adversity, in general, their academic performance seems to go down if they have less supportive caregiving relationships. What I think is remarkable is this line. So these are kids who are homeless, experiencing enormous amounts of adversity. If they have a positive relationship with the caregiver, even as their exposure to adversity goes up, their performance in school stays the same, right? So these are just a few highlights. I could have spent the whole time up here showing you different slides that look exactly like this. And why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because the way that I conceptualize family separation within the context of the science of adversity and what we know about how these experiences impact children's development is that we are taking a group of children who are enormously vulnerable. They're vulnerable as a result of exposure to trauma and other forms of chronic adversity in early life. They're vulnerable to developing mental health problems and physical health problems because of changes in the brain and changes in sort of even biological aging that occur as a result of these early experiences. And we are removing the largest source of protection that these children have in their lives, which is a stable and supportive relationship with a caregiver. And what we are doing is simply magnifying the risk that this already vulnerable group is experiencing to the whole host of negative consequences that I just described to you. Again, I'm not a policy expert, and I'm not here to make recommendations about how our policy should be changed. But I think that when we conceptualize these potential long-term consequences of adversity, it may be helpful to kind of inform a discussion about how we could be doing a better job and how we could be not sort of promulgating the trauma that these kids arrive with at our border, and instead do more to protect them. So thank you for your time and attention. And these are some of my lab members who did most of the work that I showed you today. And, thanks.
Thank you for the talks. I think these are a wonderful introduction into the multidisciplinary nature of how we think about the well-being of youth, and in particular immigrant youth. We're going to transition to the discussion now. So if you have filled out those cards, you can start passing them to the end of your rows. And if you think of questions as we're going, please feel free to also fill it out and just raise your hand, and someone will come by and get the cards from you then. All right. So as we think about the talks that you've both presented, I think there's a lot for us to consider about how each of us, from our perspectives of scholarship as well as our own clinical experiences or where we are on the front line with families and youth, to think about how we can advance our own scholarship and our work, as well as thinking about advocacy and policy. So I wanted to start the session by thinking a little bit more about the question that you brought up at the end. So how do we think about alternatives to family separation? And I know that we're not necessarily the policy experts, but the question is, as we think about it from the lens of the work that you both have done and your experience as well directly serving youth, what do you think are considerations that we should be taking into account? Are there policies that you've heard of that think might work? And is there work that you think there is to be done in that vein? I'll leave it sort of open.
Some of the work that I've done with Ingrid Egley and other colleagues at UCLA is on family detention. One of the biggest arguments from the Trump administration and others is that we need to detain families or they won't come to court. Or we need to separate families so that families don't come in the first place because they're just going to get lost in the system. They're never going to be held to account. Now, we did research looking from 2001 to 2016 at every single immigration proceeding that had occurred for families. And we found that 86% of these families were attending their court hearings. Right? So they were going to court, and it was upward of 95, 96% if we're talking about those who have actually applied for asylum. So there's a lot of compliance in the sense from the families. So the argument that actually we need to be detaining families longer is not particularly helpful. And in fact, there's been some work that was done, a pilot study by ICE for an alternative to detention, where they didn't detain families, they kept them separate under some kind of supervision. And they, again, doing a lot of, they're coming to court, they are engaged in the legal process as they should be. So I think that's something to be thinking about because we know that detention exacerbates trauma, even if it's with a parent.
So I'm not a policy expert, and I don't know about policies that, specific policies that would be an alternative. I think my perspective is, as a clinical psychologist, that, is this on? Can you guys hear me? Yeah? Okay. Some kinds of trauma are unavoidable, right? We can't be in the business of preventing all kinds of trauma. And some kinds of trauma are preventable. And I see the policies that are being enacted currently as engaged in enacting preventable trauma on children and their families. I don't know what the right alternative is. I'm not a policymaker or a political scientist, but I know that we can do better than what we're currently doing.
And then I think building on that, one of the questions from our audience is, in the absence of caregiver support, what other strategies have been shown to be effective in mitigating childhood adversity and trauma?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's an entire science that's now been built on this construct of sort of resilience. Like what prevents long-term negative outcomes in the context of serious adversity? And there's lots of factors, right? Some of them are factors that are intrinsic to the child. I will say that the factor that has most consistently emerged in that study, and lots of studies that have been done over many, many decades, is a strong supportive relationship with a caregiver. It's by far the most protective or sort of resilience-promoting characteristic that we know about. But there are lots of others. There's some that are factors intrinsic to a child, things about your personality, how sociable and extroverted you are, your IQ, things that we generally can't do a lot about. There are factors that have to do with how kids sort of respond to cues in their environment that could be things we could target with interventions. So, for example, in our work, we've shown that kids who are really sensitive to rewards, kids who are highly motivated by sort of positive cues in their environment, are buffered against experiencing mental health problems following adversity. And this is interesting because we have treatments that specifically target those sort of responses to reward, like things like behavioral activation, which is a treatment we sometimes use for depression, but can be used also in kids. And then there's broader aspects of the culture, the community, the family in which the child is residing in that can confer resilience. Having strong family relationships, having strong peer relationships, being in a supportive community context, having strong connection to your culture. There's many, many factors, strong spiritual beliefs that promote resilience. Anne Maston, who is one of the leading scientists on resilience, has a term that I really like, and she calls resilience ordinary magic, because there's no one ingredient or one sort of magic bullet that promotes resilience in everyone. And it's often sort of ordinary things like, having a strong relationship with a coach or a teacher, or being a kid who's really extroverted and sociable that might sort of confer resilience even in the context of extreme adversity. And so I like that term because what we see is even in the face of extreme adversity, many, many kids are resilient, and there are many factors that can promote that resilience, many of which we can capitalize on in response to the current situation.
In my work with kids, So I work with mostly unaccompanied minors who have been released as sponsors, and oftentimes they have a strong relationship, or they're able to develop a strong relationship with their caregiver, and it's really, really important. I'd like to also note that even though we're talking about these kids and all the traumatic experiences and adverse experiences that they have lived and survived, they're also extremely resilient. They're here. They made it. That's amazing, right? And so when I'm working with kids, I try to support them in thinking about their journey here and the amount of strength that it took for them to get here, and to try to help them see their strengths and build off of them. But at the end of the day, internal strengths need to be buttressed by social and psychological support. So that's also something that we focus on a lot, because, you know, being a lawyer, you focus on the legal, but if you don't focus on the social, emotional well-being, kids are not going to make it, even though they've made it here.
Yeah, I have to say, I see that a lot just clinically, that resilience piece, and especially for children seeking asylum, when we're trying to forensically sort of document from a psychological perspective how children are doing once they've arrived, we often find that children are actually doing really well. And it's because once they've had a chance to sort of settle in, have the supports, that does tend to be the thing that comes out. And as I think physicians, one of our roles is often to try to explain that, so that when children go to court, the judge doesn't see, oh, you're doing great, nothing must have happened to you, but for them to understand that with the appropriate supports, children, that this is what will happen. And so that can be celebrated. Right, it should be celebrated and not punished. So sort of building on that, this is directed at you, Stephen. How would you recommend that Flores be translated into permanent and concrete policy?
Great question. I think the Flores settlement itself has great language, and the impulse is in the right place. I don't see why you can't codify a lot of the protections that are in Flores. So that's already happened with the Trafficking Victims Reauthorization Protection Act of 2008. It codified some of the need to release kids with all due haste, and so I think that taking the structure of Flores, that is, kids absent some other need, they need to be placed in licensed care facilities, licensed in the state which they're living, non-secure, and that family support is identified as quickly as possible in getting them out of those situations, so that they can be part of communities, they can build relationships, and so I see that's very little that's not good in the Flores Agreement that could be translated. But obviously, we're in a situation in which the Flores is trying to be dismantled. And so some of the key protections about getting kids out as quickly as possible, housing them in non-licensed facilities, right, with no educational resources, no opportunities for them to kind of heal, it's going to be very detrimental. And I do wish that the government would take a different perspective. That's something that we can fight for.
Okay, we're going to go back to you. And this is actually, this comes up a lot this question is about memory, which comes up a lot for me, again, in doing forensic evaluations for children seeking asylum. Do you think that decreases in memory could possibly serve as a defense mechanism for children who have experienced adversity? For instance, perhaps lowered memory allows for these children to protect themselves from the memories of abuse. They forget these experiences, and maybe this forgetting serves as an adaptive purpose?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that in general, when we look at what the changes that happen in the brain in response to adversity, the thing that I always try to highlight is that many of the changes that occur are highly adaptive if you're growing up in a dangerous environment. They ensure your survival. They help to protect you in that context. It's when you leave that context and enter into a new environment, an environment that's different, or where the expectations on you are different, that those changes in the brain can really start to confer risk for long-term problems. And so, absolutely, potentially. I mean, I think, we're not sure, but some of the changes in memory that we see, and maybe getting a little bit too complex, but we often see that the places where kids have the most trouble with their memory are in situations where there's like an emotional distraction in the environment, something that's capturing their attention in the way that we talked about. There's like a threat cue present. What's happening is these kids are their attention is laser focused on that, which means they're not taking in aspects of the broader context that they then have a hard time remembering later. And in the short term, that's probably really adaptive. It's helping them stay safe in a dangerous environment by ensuring they're paying attention to the most important cues in their environment. But it comes at a cost later, which makes it more difficult for them to remember things that were sort of happening in the background of those really salient cues. So in general, I think that the way we can conceptualize changes in the brain following adversity is very meaningful adaptations to a current environment that only become sort of problematic when that environment changes.
And then in your experience, I would say working with immigrant youth, how do you find that those challenges with memory sort of play out? How does it show up in your work with children?
I think that's also a very good question. We work with kids oftentimes in writing their stories and telling their stories. And, we can do it a couple of different ways. We can have them draw pictures or write out their story depending on their age level. I work with mostly, I would say, older kids, 13 to 17. And part of the conversation that we have is having them relive their stories. And I will tell you that more often than not, the stories change a little bit. Or they think that they remember something, they don't quite remember it. And, as many attorneys, thinking about the clock and trying to help as many people as possible and trying to hit deadlines, that's frustrating. But at the same time, from a kind of psychological adaptive perspective, it makes sense that they would have difficulties remembering some of these key issues. And so that you need to, not judge them for it. Understand why they have adapted the way they have. And even though it makes your job a little bit harder, that's an important part of the process. Unfortunately, judges and asylum officers don't view it that way. So there's a lot of work that goes in with kids and helping them tell their story in a way that's going to be understood by a judge, and that means working through details or excising details and having them be able to tell why they can't remember. And I think some of the research that you're doing and others is very helpful from a legal perspective to educate judges and officers why, if a child doesn't quite remember or remembers something very, very specifically but can't remember something in the surrounding environment at the time, it shouldn't undermine their credibility. In fact, it's logical.
The next question is about research findings for transgenerational trauma. Are there solid research findings on transgenerational trauma? And if so, how can this be leveraged to create clinical support for immigrant children and parents?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of evidence for what people in the scientific literature sometimes call the cycle of violence, right? Which is that, parents who have experienced violence in their own lives are more likely to have kids who are exposed to violence, either in the context of the family or in the surrounding community. And, the mechanisms that underlie that sort of cycle of violence we know a little bit about them. Some of them have to do with relatively straightforward explanations like chronic poverty and structural barriers and discrimination, right, that keep families sort of stuck in certain communities where violence is common. Some have to do with some of the very changes in sort of the brain and behavior that happen following trauma exposure, where if you're somebody who's experienced violence yourself, sort of changes the way that you process information. So one of the findings that I talked about just very briefly, the sort of hostile attribution bias, like what you see in kids who have been exposed to violence is that when they're in ambiguous situations, they're very likely to assume that someone's trying to hurt them. They're also very likely to respond to that perceived provocation with aggressive responses, right? I'm going to hit you before you can hit me, right? It's a very adaptive, logical thing to do if you're trying to stay safe and prevent yourself from being exposed to more victimization. So it's that very behavioral pattern that might help them stay safe, but that sort of propagates and perpetuates exposure to violence. So we know about some of those behavioral patterns. We don't know a lot about sort of the biological mechanisms that underlie sort of intergenerational transmission of violence and trauma. But I would say a lot of the variance is probably also explained at the structural level by things like chronic poverty and discrimination.
And if you think about a lot of the context that the kids are coming from, especially from Central America, there's trauma travels, and it travels across generations in the sense that, Central America, the civil wars, seeing like Guatemala, they had a peace accord in '96, but before then there was near genocide of some indigenous populations, and then you have the entire country is involved in violence, and then you have soldiers who have kids who are violent towards their spouses or partners, and the kids witness that. And at the same time, you have weakened social institutions, weakened governmental institutions that are not there to protect kids, and then gangs come in. And so I think that some of the structural issues become really, really important in explaining why violence travels across time.
And I think thinking about that from the lens of family separation or family detention, I guess, what is the natural extension of that? And I guess I asked that question from two perspectives. The first is of families at the border, but also of families, Stephen, you touched on this at the beginning, that there's separation happening within the U.S. We know that there's still some cases of separation for sure happening at the border, even if it's not the official policy of the day. But how do you think about that in that setting?
Well, we are, what was the term you used, preventable? A lot of preventable trauma. I think at this point, the trauma is there. And so it's our job as communities that are receiving families that are being released either immediately or after some kind of detention, that we intervene, that we be the kind of the intermediaries, the caregivers that buffer them from any of the kind of consistent effects of the violence downstream. I know California is a relatively supportive state. Not all of them are. But as we think about responses to the trauma that's happened, that's already there, we can think about, well, what can we do to help support these kids and these families avoid some of the longer-term consequences of the trauma that they've experienced at our hands because of our policies. Because of the way that we view immigrants and the way that we treat them when they're in government custody.
I mean, I think that this question raises for me sort of an issue we haven't touched on, but that's also cause for hope, which is that we actually have really effective interventions for kids who have experienced trauma. There are evidence-based treatments. They don't take very long. They take a few months that lead to substantial improvements in mental health and physical health in kids who have experienced trauma. The problem is that most of the kids who need those interventions don't have access to them. So while I don't know much about how to sort of change the structural problems that lead to detentions and family separation, policies can be made to provide, greater access to evidence-based treatments that already exist for kids and for families who have experienced trauma. And we know that those treatments can prevent this sort of cycle of violence from perpetuating by, preventing or treating the sort of mental health consequences, some of the behavioral changes, and there's now even evidence that some of these treatments can lead to changes in the very brain systems that we talked about today, that providing better access to evidence-based treatments and disseminating and implementing those interventions in the community, I think is one thing that we can do. And there's actually work right here at UCLA. Bruce Torpeda, who's in the psychology department, his whole program of research is on how do we sort of disseminate and get treatments that we know work into the community, into the hands of people who need them. And so I think as medical professionals, psychologists, clinicians, this is an avenue we can push for and something that I think is actually achievable.
And oftentimes these kids, we know who they are. They're in removal proceedings. They've been released from custody, and so there's an opportunity to recognize that they will have suffered some kind of trauma just from the nature of being detained, and that we we can counterbalance that, and we should.
See, this question actually goes pretty well with what you have already talked about. And so I think what I'd like to do with it is, the question is, can you expand on the subject of caregiver buffering for kids in foster care or kids who have been separated from their biological parent? And I think what I'd like to say is, I think that topic is important, and also I think the reverse. So how does it harm children and then their parents' health, like from the perspective of their parents' health when they're separated from their parents?
It's a great question. One of the things that we know has a huge impact on how kids respond to trauma is how their parents respond to trauma, right? So when a kid experiences trauma, their parent, whether they experience that trauma or not, is aware of it. One of the biggest predictors of how the kids respond in terms of their mental health is how the parents respond. Did the parent develop depression, anxiety, express a lot of distress about it? If so, the kid is much more likely to express those types of reactions, right? So, family separation is traumatic not only for the children, but also for the parents who are separated from their kids, right? And while we don't have good data on this phenomenon happening right now in this country, it's a very difficult question to do research on. But we know from lots of other kinds of research that this is going to increase risk for mental health problems, for anxiety, for separation anxiety, for attachment problems in the kids, and probably increase risk for mental health problems in the parents as well, which is going to lead to a variety of other adverse consequences. What I will say about caregiver buffering is that, back to the sort of question about resilience. I teach an undergrad class on stress where when we talk about resilience, and we do these case studies in resilience who are people who experience remarkable adversity and who have exhibited remarkable sort of growth and resilience and are thriving, even having experienced enormous adversity. And in almost every one of the stories, there's an adult. It's not always a caregiver. It's usually not a caregiver, actually, in many of these stories. Somebody that was emotionally invested in the child, a coach, a neighbor, an uncle, whoever. It doesn't have to be a caregiver, right? It doesn't matter if it's a biological parent or even the person who's taking care of you day to day, that just one adult in that child's life who's emotionally invested, who cares about their well-being, who the child knows they can rely on, has consistently been shown to be an enormous source of adversity. So I think that is another window into what can be done in these situations, which is ensuring that, if we are going to have a policy where kids are kept separate from their parents, there should be supportive adults in that context, people who can help to, even in this sort of extremely stressful situation, potentially help to mitigate or buffer some of the consequences.
I want to do a quick shout out to my high school counselor, Paige Marshall Reed, who was that person in my life, and I'm very thankful for her.
And I think, thinking about that when we think about the policies with Flores, and how do you, I guess from an advocacy lens and from a policy lens, when we're thinking about the release of children to other adults that might be in their circle, an aunt, right, for example, how do you think about that release from a policy standpoint? Is that something that, where are things with that?
So for minors that are, I guess, unaccompanied, and they're released to a sponsor, there's a hierarchy. Preference should be given to parents, and then relatives, and then non-relatives. And a lot of the work that I do with kids is helping them having their sponsor become a guardian under California law, which means that they take on the role of a parent until the minor's 18, or if they're already 18, until they're 21. Now, California's got a special law for these guardianships for 18-year-olds, mostly for immigrant kids, so that they can get access to a special juvenile visa. But it's critically important, regardless of the immigration consequences, because there's an adult saying, I'm going to support you until you're 21, in front of California law. I'm on the hook. I'm a functionary of the state of California to take care of this child. And so a lot of the work I do is kind of helping kids connect with their sponsors, be it an aunt, or even if it's a friend of the family, so that they build a kind of confidence and trust that they need to be able to rely on this person. And unfortunately, the sponsors aren't always the most supportive. Sometimes they're the ones that are trafficking the minors. There's a lot of friction. It may even be a parent, but they haven't seen their parent for 10 years. So they come back and they feel abandoned by a parent, and they have trouble kind of connecting again. So it's critically important, and it's half of the discussion that I have with kids is how they're relating to their caregivers.
All right, so this will be our last question, and it's going to be about how we can use the Flores Agreement to leverage for more humane immigration policy, especially regarding detention.
Well, so the litigation around Flores is ongoing. There's a special monitor. I just got an email from Peter Shea. He's from the Center for Human Rights and Constitutional Law. He was one of the original attorneys on the Flores settlement in 1985. And they are doing monitoring. So they're going to certain kinds of facilities, and they're monitoring CBP to make sure that they're providing the kind of safe environment that these kids need. I think that's actually what needs to happen. There needs to be more work in shedding light on how kids are being treated in custody of the government. There had been 0 deaths in government custody up until last year. And now we have 6 that we know of, and potentially more. So it's a time for us to come together and to work with the team that are going to these sites, and they're going to be under the law observing how children are treated. And it's an important work that needs to be done.
I think that's a good place to end on the work that there is to be done. I just wanted to thank our speakers, and we have small tokens for you. And I also wanted to thank Lisa Gantz, who has spearheaded the Immigrant Youth Task Force here. We're going to continue the discussion outside. There'll be refreshments, and then our speakers will all be outside. And hopefully you'll all get to connect with people across disciplines here outside of your individual school. And we'll continue the discussion at the next speaker series. Please complete your evaluations and let us know if there's any speakers or areas that you're particularly interested in hearing more about. And thank you again for spending the evening with us.